The gavel came down so hard it cracked the edge of Judge Harlan Beecroft's table, and in that single moment, Pauline Wells felt the floor of the entire world give way beneath her feet. "Objection sustained," the judge said, his voice cutting through the muggy July air of the Dodge City Courthouse like a blade through summer wheat. "The claim filed by Mr. Silas Drennan takes precedent under the amended filing of June the 4th, 1881, which predates the Wells Homestead Declaration by 11 days. Pauline stood up so fast her chair scraped back across the raw pine floor. The sound was ugly and loud, and she did not care. 30 people were packed into that courtroom, sweating shoulder to shoulder in the heat, and every single one of them turned to look at her. She could feel their stares like brands pressed against her skin. Silas Drennan sat at the opposite table with his lawyer, a wiry man named Aldous Fitch, who wore a cream-colored suit that had never seen a day of honest labor. Silas himself was broad, graying at the temples, with small, colorless eyes that had always reminded Pauline of the flat side of a river stone. He was smiling now, not a large smile, just a small, quiet, satisfied curling at the corners of his mouth that told her he had been waiting a long time for this particular moment. The trap had been set before she even arrived in Kansas. "Your Honor," Pauline's voice came out steadier than she felt. She was 26 years old, alone in the territory, and standing in a room full of men who largely believed a woman had no business holding title to 320 acres of grassland. She had learned a long time ago that the only thing more dangerous than showing fear was showing it to people who would use it. "I would like the opportunity to address this court." Judge Beecroft looked at her over the edge of his spectacles. He was a man in his late 50s, white-haired, with a face that had been worn down to something almost kind by decades of difficult decisions. He had been appointed by the territorial government, and he had a reputation, people said, for being fair. Pauline was about to find out whether that reputation was earned. "This is a civil land proceeding, Miss Wells, not a trial. Mr. Fitch has presented a forgery," Pauline said. The room went dead silent. Even the flies seemed to stop moving in the thick air. She had not planned to say that word. But it was the truth, and she had been holding it in her chest for 11 days since she first received the notice of objection, carrying it around like a stone she could not put down, and now it was out in the room and she could either stand behind it or drown. Owen Calloway, seated in the third row of the gallery, leaned forward on his elbows and watched her with an expression she would not understand until much later. He had been watching Pauline Wells for the better part of 3 months, ever since she first drove her wagon out onto the section of land north of Crooked Creek, and began building a life there with the methodical ferocity of someone who had nothing left to lose. He had watched her carry fence posts. He had watched her plant a kitchen garden. He had watched her drive nails into the frame of her small house with a precision that suggested she had done this before and was not impressed by anyone who assumed otherwise. He was a deputy out of the sheriff's office, broad-shouldered and quiet, with dark brown hair and green eyes that people sometimes described as careful. He was 31 years old, and he had seen a great many things in the Kansas territory that required him to look at people with a great deal of carefulness. He looked at Pauline Wells now with everything he had. "Miss Wells." Judge Beecroft set his gavel down slowly, as though placing it rather than surrendering it. "That is a serious accusation." "Yes, Your Honor, it is." She reached into the worn leather satchel she had placed on the table beside her and drew out a folded document. "And I can prove it. Now we must go back, because what happened next in that courtroom was not the beginning of the story. It was only the place where everything that had been building in secret finally broke the surface. The story began 11 months earlier, in the last days of August, 1880. When Pauline Wells arrived in Dodge City on the Santa Fe Railroad with a single trunk, a satchel, and a legal filing she had obtained through the Homestead Act of 1862. The act entitled any American citizen who had never taken up arms against the United States government to claim 160 acres of federal land, provided they built a dwelling, and cultivated the land for 5 years. Pauline had read about the amended Kansas provisions that allowed women who were widowed or single heads of household to file for double allotments, 320 acres, and she had read it 3 times to be sure she understood it correctly. She had understood it correctly, and she had traveled from St. Louis with a deed of intent and a plan that she had built the way she built everything carefully, brick by brick, making sure each layer was solid before she set the next one on top of it. What she had not built into her plan was the town of Dodge City itself. She had imagined something simpler: a land office, a piece of paper, an empty stretch of grass. She had not imagined the dust that sat in the air like a living thing in late summer, or the cattle pens that roared with the weight of 10,000 longhorns being moved through on their way north, or the noise of Front Street at any hour of the day or night. She had not imagined how the men at the land office would look at her when she slid her papers across the counter, as though she had placed something slightly obscene there rather than a perfectly legal document. The land officer was a man named Gerald Prout. He had a round face and a brown mustache that he kept touching with 2 fingers, and he looked at her papers for a long time before he looked back up at her. "Miss Wells," he said, drawing out the word miss in a way that she was learning to identify as a specific type of verbal obstruction. "The section you've indicated on the northwest quadrant above Crooked Creek, are you aware that that land has been previously inquired after?" "Inquired after is not the same as claimed," Pauline said pleasantly. "No, but Mr. Drennan has been inquiring for how long?" Gerald Prout touched his mustache. "Coming on 2 years." "Then Mr. Drennan had 2 years to file a claim under the same provisions I am filing under today, and he chose not to," Pauline said. "I would like my filing stamped and recorded, please." It had been stamped and recorded on August 26, 1880. Pauline had stood there and watched it happen, and she had folded her copy of the receipt and put it inside the lining of her satchel where she kept things that mattered. She drove out to the land the following morning in a wagon she had hired from a stable on 2nd Avenue, loaded with the tools and supplies she had purchased the day before. The road north from Dodge City was a rutted dirt track that wound through grassland that went on so far in every direction that you stopped believing in horizons. The sky above it was enormous and pale and relentless. Pauline had spent all her life in cities, first Cincinnati, where she had been born, then St. Louis, where she had worked as a seamstress, and then as a bookkeeper for a dry goods firm after her husband Richard Wells died of a fever in the winter of 1878. She had spent 2 years being widowed, and 2 years being politely, persistently, invisibly diminished by a world that had decided she was no longer a complete person on her own. She drove out onto the prairie and she thought, "This is mine," and she meant it the way people only mean things when they have paid for them in full. The land was flat and golden with late summer grass, and there was a creek that curved through the northwest corner of her section like a sentence ending in a question mark. She stood at the edge of it for a long time the first morning, watching the water move over the stones, and she felt something she had not felt in 2 years, which was the sensation of being exactly where she was supposed to be. She started building the following day. There was a man at the neighboring claim, half a mile east, who came over on her 3rd day there with a covered dish and an introduction. His name was Clarence Muir. He was 60-something and weathered and kind-eyed, and he told her that if she needed anything she should come and find him. She thanked him and meant it. He was to become one of the few genuine friends she made in that territory. Silas Drennan she met on the 4th day. He came from the south on a large gray horse, alone, and he pulled up at the edge of what was going to be her kitchen garden once she got the ground broken and looked down at her the way a man looks at something he has already decided is in the wrong place. "You're the woman who filed on the Crooked Creek section," he said. It was not a question. "I'm the woman who homesteaded the northwest quadrant above Crooked Creek." "Yes," Pauline said, not stopping her work. She was driving fence stakes with a mallet and she kept driving them. "This land's been designated for range expansion." Silas said. "I have 4,000 head of cattle that'll be needing the grazing rights come spring. Then I suggest you look into range leasing agreements through the Territorial Land Office," Pauline said. "This section has been homesteaded under federal provision. It's not available for grazing." He looked at her for a long moment with those flat river-stone eyes. He was a man who was used to problems resolving themselves when he stared at them long enough. She was clearly a problem that was not going to resolve. "This isn't a sensible place for a woman alone," he said finally. "I'll take that under advisement," Pauline said, and drove the next fence stake in. He rode away. But he did not go far and he did not go quietly, and over the weeks that followed, Pauline became aware of the shape of the problem she had placed herself inside. Silas Drennan was not merely a rancher who wanted grazing land. He was the most powerful landholder in the county, a man with money in the Dodge City Bank and friends in the territorial legislature, and a history of acquiring land that other people were using through methods that fell, technically, just inside the law. He had been watching the Crooked Creek section for 2 years because the creek itself was the only reliable water source in a 12-mile radius, and whoever controlled the water controlled the range. She was not just standing on his land in his mind. She was standing on his water. She found out about Owen Calloway on a Tuesday morning in late September when she drove into town to buy lumber, and he was the one who helped her load it into her wagon. She had not asked for help. She had been loading boards methodically from the stack outside the lumber yard, measuring them against the side of the wagon with her eye, when a pair of hands appeared at the other end of a 12-foot plank and lifted it with her. She looked up. He was taller than she had expected, with the kind of build that suggested he had been doing physical work since he was young. He wore a deputy's badge on his coat, slightly crooked, as though he put it on every morning without looking in a mirror. "I had it," she said. "I know," he said. "I'm fast-tracking it." She paused. "I beg your pardon. Getting your wagon loaded faster," he said. "You've got 11 more boards to go and the clouds are coming in from the northwest. You'll want to be on the road before the rain hits." She looked at the sky. He was correct. She looked back at him. He had the kind of face that was hard to read quickly, which she respected even when it was inconvenient. "Owen Calloway," he said, and offered his hand. "Pauline Wells," she said, and shook it. He helped her load the lumber. He did not ask her questions she had not invited. He did not tell her she was doing anything wrong or suggest that she ought to be doing something different instead. When the wagon was loaded, he stepped back and said, "The road north gets soft at the low crossing when the rain hits it. You'll want to stay in the ruts." "Thank you," she said, and meant it. She drove away thinking that he was either genuinely helpful or very good at appearing so, and she had met enough men of both types to know that the difference mattered enormously. She found out which type he was over the weeks that followed because he kept appearing, not in a way that felt like following. More in a way that felt like geography, like he was simply a feature of the particular landscape she now inhabited, the way Crooked Creek was a feature, and the flat horizon was a feature, and the enormous Kansas sky was a feature. He was at the general store when she was there. He was on the road north when she was driving. He came past her homestead twice on his rounds, and both times he stopped and asked if she had seen anything unusual, which was the professional version of asking if she was all right without saying so. The second time he stopped, she was mending a section of fence that something had knocked down in the night, and she looked up from the wire and said, "Do you always take this road on your rounds?" "I do now," he said without hesitation. She stood up. Because of Silas Drennan, he looked at her steadily. There was something careful and honest in that look that she had not expected and that she would think about later for a long time. "Partly," he said, "and partly not." She understood what that meant. It was the clearest thing a man like Owen Calloway was likely to say about something like that, and she had been a widow long enough to know that direct declarations were rarer and less meaningful than people thought, and that it was the indirect things, the showing up, the paying attention, the adjusting your route, that told the truth. She said nothing, but she stopped pretending she had not noticed him noticing her. October came in cool and bright. the grass going gold and amber across the plain, and Pauline's house was framed and roofed and starting to become a real thing, rather than a set of plans she carried in her head. Clarence Muir came over one afternoon and declared it the finest small house north of the creek, which she suspected was both a compliment and a low bar, but she accepted it gratefully. She had a stove now, and a proper floor, and 2 windows facing south to catch the winter light. She also had trouble. On a Wednesday morning in early October, she woke to find 3 of her fence posts pulled from the ground and scattered across her kitchen garden, the wire lying in loops like sleeping snakes across the turned earth. She stood in the cold morning air and looked at it, and felt the very particular fury of someone whose work has been deliberately undone. She drove to town and found Owen at the sheriff's office. He was drinking coffee from a tin cup and reading a report when she walked in, and he set the cup down before she had said a single word. "What happened?" he said. "Fence destruction," she told him. "My northwest corner, overnight." He got his coat and his hat and came with her, and he walked the perimeter of the damage with the methodical attention of someone who was looking for something specific rather than the general pattern of it. He crouched in the mud at the base of one of the pulled posts and studied the ground. "Horse hooves," he said. "Shod, heavy animal." He looked up at her. "How many men do you think?" "2 at least," she said. "To do this much in the dark." He stood up. He did not look toward Drennan's range to the south, but she saw the direction of his thought. "I'll file a report," he said, "but I want to be honest with you, Pauline." It was the first time he had used her given name, and they both heard it. "The sheriff and Drennan have a relationship that goes back a long way. A fence complaint isn't going to move fast." "What will move fast?" she said. He thought about it. "Evidence," he said. "Something documented and specific and hard to look away from." "Then I'll get that," she said. She started keeping a journal after that. Date, time, incident, evidence. He sketched the hoof patterns in the mud. She noted the direction the posts had been dragged. She saved a piece of wire that had been cut rather than broken, because you did not cut wire by accident, and the cut end told a story about the tool that made it. Owen came out twice more to look at the journal, and he read it with the same careful attention he brought to everything, and he said, "You would make an excellent deputy." "I'm making an excellent homesteader," she said. "Which is harder?" He smiled at that. It was the first time she had seen him smile properly, and it changed his face into something warmer and younger and more open, and she thought about it for several days afterward in the evenings when she was alone, and the fire was burning low, and there was nothing between her and the dark prairie but the walls she had built herself. She did not let herself call it anything. She was not ready to call it anything. Her husband Richard had been a good man, and she had loved him, and losing him had left a wound that healed slowly and left scar tissue where the openness used to be. She had come out to the prairie to rebuild herself, not to need someone new, and she was careful about that line the way you are careful about fire when you are building things out of wood. But November came, and Owen Calloway came with it, regular as weather. He started bringing things, not flowers or tokens or anything that could be called courting in any formal sense, nothing that could embarrass either of them. He brought her a copy of the updated territorial land regulations, folded small and carried in his coat pocket, because he had thought she would want to know about the changes. He brought news from town. He brought a book once, a volume of natural history that he said he had finished and thought might interest her. It had a chapter on prairie grasses that she read twice. She brought him coffee when he came by. Real coffee, not the burned chicory that passed for it in the sheriff's office, which she had learned was one of his particular complaints about the job. He drank it standing by her fence with the look of a man who was pretending he was not somewhere he had chosen to be. One afternoon in November, when the first serious cold had come in off the plains and the sky was a low gray ceiling pressing down on everything, she came outside to find him fixing her south gate, which had been hanging crooked since October. She stood in the doorway and watched him for a moment. He did not notice her. He was working with full concentration, the way he did everything, his coat collar turned up against the cold, his hands sure on the wood. He had brought his own tools. "You didn't ask permission to do that," she said. He looked up. There was something in his eyes that was half apology and half absolutely not apologetic. "It was bothering me," he said. "It was going to bother you all winter." "It was," she agreed. "But so is the principle." He set down his hammer. "Would you have told me not to?" She thought about it honestly. "No," she said. "Then I apologize for the gate," he said, "and I'll finish it." She brought him coffee and sat on the step and watched him work, and it was one of those moments that does not announce itself as significant while it is happening, but that you know in the back of the mind that keeps score of things will matter later. She asked him, that afternoon, how he came to be a deputy in Dodge City. He told her plainly. He had grown up in Colorado, worked cattle for 8 years, and come to Kansas after a violent incident on the range that he described briefly and without evasion. A rancher's son had been killed in a dispute over water rights that should have been mediated and wasn't, and Owen had been the one who found the body and who spent the following year doing what the law had failed to do, which was pursue the man responsible. At the end of that year, he had a better understanding of how the law worked and how it failed, and he had come to Dodge City and put on a badge because he thought that was more useful than not. "And what do you think now?" she asked. "Is it more useful?" He looked at her steadily. "Most days," he said. "Not always." "When is it not useful?" "When the wrong men have their hands in it," he said. And there it was, the plain shape of the thing she had been circling around, the fact that the sheriff's relationship with Silas Drennan was not a professional neutrality but a financial arrangement, and that the law in Dodge City was not blind so much as selectively sighted. She had already suspected it. Hearing him say it aloud made her feel two things simultaneously, more afraid and less alone. December came in hard with a killing frost that turned the creek to glass, and Pauline battened her house against it with strips of rags in the window frames and a heavy quilt over the door and her stove working from before dawn until after dark. She had laid in enough wood and provisions to last the winter, and she was not afraid of the cold itself, only of the things it could do to her buildings while she could not be watching them. On the first Friday of December, she drove to town for supplies and found a notice posted to the door of the land office. It was a legal notice of inquiry, filed by Silas Drennan through his lawyer Aldous Fitch, questioning the validity of the original survey that had established the northwest quadrant above Crooked Creek as a separately accessible homestead section. The inquiry suggested that the section had been mismarked on the county plat, and that it properly fell within the range leasing territory that Drennan had registered interest in. She read it 3 times standing in the cold, her breath making small clouds in the air. She had expected an attack on her claim. She had not expected this particular attack, which was subtle enough to be frightening. Arguing that she had personally done something wrong was one thing. Arguing that the survey itself was wrong was another, because it raised questions about the land office records that would take time and money and expertise to resolve. And time and money and expertise were all things Silas Drennan had in larger supply than she did. She went into the land office and found Gerald Prout and asked him to explain the notice to her. He touched his mustache several times and explained, reluctantly, that a competing claim was now on record and would be heard at the county land court in January. She drove to the sheriff's office. Owen was there, and the moment she came through the door he read her face with the accuracy of someone who had been paying close attention to it for months. "What happened?" he said. She showed him the notice. He read it, his jaw set in a way she had not seen before, which told her he was controlling something behind his expression. "Fitch drafted this," he said. "He's good at this kind of legal maneuver. He picks the edge of the valid zone and files just inside it." "Can it work?" she said. "It depends on the judge," Owen said slowly. He looked at her. "Beecroft is the county land judge. He's honest, I think. But Drennan's lawyer will come in with documentation and Fitch will make it look like settled fact." "Then I need better documentation," she said. "You need proof of the original survey accuracy," he said. "A proper surveyor's report. And you need something that challenges whatever Fitch is going to present as evidence of misregistration." "Where do I get a surveyor?" I know a man in Wichita, Owen said. He's good, and he's not in Drennan's pocket. Will he come out here? For the right fee, yes. He paused. I can front the money, Pauline. She looked at him carefully. That's a significant offer, she said. It's a significant injustice, he said. And you shouldn't have to fight it alone because one man thinks he can buy everything that touches water. She thought for a moment about what it meant to accept that kind of help, what it implied and what it required. She had come out here to be independent, but she had also come out here to be real, and real people helped each other, and that was not weakness. All right, she said, but I'll pay you back every cent. I know you will, he said, and did not make anything more of it than that. He wrote the letter to the surveyor in Wichita that afternoon, right there at his desk with her sitting across from him, and she watched his handwriting, which was clean and careful and slightly old-fashioned, and thought that this was a man who wrote like he did everything else, with full attention and no wasted motion. The surveyor, whose name was Art Hindley, arrived in the second week of December and spent 3 days walking Pauline's section with his instruments. He was a compact, precise man of about 50 who asked excellent questions and wrote his findings in a hand even more careful than Owen's. He reported that the original survey was accurate, that the northwest quadrant boundary was properly established, and that the plat registration at the county land office was correct in all material respects. He also noted something else, which was that an annotation had been made to the county plat book in what appeared to be a different hand from the original entries, adding a notation about range leasing priority in the Crooked Creek section. The annotation was undated. Pauline stared at that part of his report for a long time. Undated, she said, meaning it could have been added at any time, Hindley said, including recently. She went to Owen with this finding, and he read it twice and then looked up at her with an expression that was not quite satisfaction and not quite anger, but something that lived between them. Someone altered the plat book, he said. Fitch probably, she said, or someone in the land office. Gerald Prout, Owen said, and the name came out with a flatness that told her this was not a surprise. Is there proof? The annotation is in Prout's handwriting, Hindley had said. They had brought him to Owen's office, and he confirmed it there, spreading the copy of the plat alongside a sample of Prout's other notations from the book. The letter forms were identical. The pen pressure was consistent. This is forgery, Owen said. Yes, Pauline said. That's what I said in court. But that moment was still weeks away. First came Christmas, which Pauline spent quietly, alone in her house with a good fire and a letter she wrote to her sister in Cincinnati, and the volume of natural history that Owen had lent her. She had been going to read more about the prairie grasses, but she kept turning instead to a passage about migration patterns, about animals and birds that traveled enormous distances, not because they were fleeing something, but because they were following something. Some deep internal knowledge of where they needed to be. She had been following that same thing, she thought, all the way from Cincinnati to St. Louis to the Santa Fe Railroad to this small wooden house on a creek in Kansas. She had been following something, and she was starting to understand what it was. Owen came by on Christmas Eve with a covered parcel that turned out to be a small oil lamp with a glass globe that threw a warm, round light. He had wrapped it in brown paper and tied it with a length of the red twine she had seen in the mercantile, which meant he had bought the twine specifically for this purpose, which meant he had planned it, and the thought of Owen Calloway planning how to wrap a Christmas gift for her made something in her chest do something she was not prepared for. She gave him the book back, with a note she had written inside the front cover. She did not tell him what the note said, and she will not have to because those things are private. But she watched him open it and read it standing in her doorway in the cold, and then he looked up at her with an expression she was going to spend the rest of her life learning to read. "Thank you," he said. "You're welcome," she said. They stood for a moment in the doorway between the cold night and the warm house, and neither of them moved and neither of them spoke. And then he said quietly, "I'll see you in the new year, Pauline," and put his hat back on and walked to his horse. And she stood in the doorway and watched him ride away into the dark with the lamp, throwing its small, warm circle at her feet. January 1881 began with bitter cold, and the knowledge that the land court hearing was 3 weeks away. Pauline spent those weeks preparing with the same systematic intensity she had brought to building her house. She organized her documentation. She organized Henley's report. She made a clear, chronological account of every incident of fence destruction and intimidation, with dates and evidence, and she tied all of it together in a logical sequence that told the story of a man who had been trying to drive her off land he did not legally own. Owen helped her think through the legal arguments. He was not a lawyer, but he had spent enough years adjacent to the law to understand how it moved and what it responded to. He sat with her at her kitchen table on 3 separate evenings, the lamp burning between them, and they went through the documents point by point. He asked hard questions. He challenged her weakest arguments and told her when she was hedging, and told her to say the plain thing instead. It was, she thought, the most productive and intellectually engaging thing she had done since leaving St. Louis, and it was also, she admitted to herself, one of the best things she had ever done in any kitchen with any man, and that was not only about the legal preparation. On the last of those evenings, when she had gotten her arguments to a place she trusted, she set down her pen and looked at him across the table. "Owen," she said. He looked up. "I know what I feel," she said. "I'm not good at not saying things. I've been not saying something for several months, and I think it's making me less efficient." He held very still. "Say it then," he said. "I care about you," she said, significantly. "In a way that I didn't plan and wasn't expecting, and that is separate from everything you've done to help me, although what you've done has made it much more certain." She paused. "I wanted you to know that." He was quiet for a moment. The fire popped in the stove. Outside, the wind moved across the plain in that low, constant way it had in Kansas, never stopping, just varying its complaint. "I have been," he said carefully, "trying not to say the same thing to you for roughly 4 months. "Why?" she said. "Because I was afraid," he said, "that you'd think I was helping you because of it, and I wanted you to trust the help." He paused. "And because you came out here to build something that was yours, I didn't want to be in the way of that." She looked at him for a long time. "You're not in the way," she said. "You're the only person who's helped me build it." He stood up from the table. She stood up too. And in the small, warm kitchen she had built herself, on a January night in Kansas with the wind outside and the lamp between them, he took her hands in his and she let him, and that was the beginning of the thing between them that was not a secret anymore. He did not kiss her that night. He held her hands for a moment and said, "After the hearing," and she understood what he meant, which was that he wanted there to be nothing mixed in it, no question of whether the tenderness was also pressure or whether the hope was also obligation. He wanted the hearing to be finished and her land to be secured and all of it to belong to her cleanly, and then he wanted to see her without the urgency of crisis between them. She loved him for that without saying so, because there was time for all of it, and the hearing was 3 weeks away. Those 3 weeks were hard and tense, and the weather was brutal and Sela's Drennan, either knowing he was about to lose or trying to ensure he did not, escalated. On the 15th of January, a group of men who were not identified came through her property at night on horses and ran her cattle. She had 12 head now, a small herd she had been building through the south fence and into the neighboring scrubland. She spent a cold morning in the dark rounding them up alone before Owen arrived and helped her drive the last 3 back through the gap. He was furious in that contained way of his, quietly and completely furious, and she watched him reset the fence posts in the frozen ground with his hands, and thought that this was a man who expressed his feelings primarily through action, and that she had chosen well. On the 20th of January, she received a visit from Aldous Fitch. He came alone in a good buggy, and he wore his cream-colored suit under a heavy coat, and he sat down in her house. She offered him nothing because she did not want him comfortable, and he placed a leather envelope on her table. "Mr. Drennan is prepared to be generous," Fitch said. "He's offering fair market value for the section, plus an additional consideration for your time and inconvenience. It's a significant sum, Miss Wells. She looked at the envelope and then at him. No, she said. He smiled the way lawyers who are paid very well smile at people who have just said something they think is unwise. You understand that the court filing. I understand the court filing perfectly, she said. I understand what it is and where it came from and who altered what document to make it possible. I also understand that you're here because your client is afraid of what I'm going to say in court, and that's the most useful information I've gotten all month. Fitch's smile thinned. He picked up his envelope. This offer will not be repeated. Good, she said. Then we won't have to discuss it again. She told Owen about the visit that afternoon, and he listened with his arms folded and his jaw set. He's worried, Owen said. I know, she said. Which means Henley's report is more damaging than they expected. They didn't know about the handwriting analysis, she said. Prout must have told Drennan what he wrote in the Platt book, but I don't think either of them expected it to be traced. Owen looked at her. Pauline, I need you to know something. Whatever happens in court, I will not let Drennan take that land from you. There are other remedies beyond the land court, and I will use all of them. I believe you, she said. But I'm going to win in court first. And on the 28th of January, 1881, they went to court. The Dodge City County Courthouse was a two-story wooden building on Chestnut Street that doubled as the city hall and was, on this particular morning, filled well beyond comfortable capacity. Land disputes in the territory had a way of drawing an audience because everyone had a stake in how they went, and the Wells versus Drennan objection had been talked about in every saloon and mercantile and stable in the county for 3 weeks. Pauline arrived in her best dress, which was dark blue wool with a white collar, and she sat down at the plaintiff's table with her documents arranged in the order she had rehearsed, and her hands folded on top of them, perfectly still. Owen was in the gallery behind her, and she knew without turning around that his eyes were on her, and that they would stay there. Silas Drennan arrived with Aldous Fitch and 2 other men who stood at the back of the room with their hats in their hands and their faces arranged in expressions of confident neutrality. Gerald Prout was in the gallery, 4th row, looking at his shoes. Judge Beecroft called the court to order. Fitch made his opening presentation smoothly and at length. He spoke about the county plat, about the range leasing notations, about the history of Drennan's recorded interest in the section, about the survey concerns, and about a second document he placed on the judge's table with a flourish. A filing dated June 4, 1880, ostensibly recording Drennan's homestead intent on the northwest quadrant, predating Pauline's August filing by 11 days. Judge Beecroft studied it. He looked at Pauline. He said the objection was sustained and brought his gavel down, and Pauline stood up. She said, in that courtroom full of sweat and silence, that Fitch had presented a forgery. The room erupted. Judge Beecroft brought his gavel down 3 more times loudly, and the room reluctantly quieted. He looked at Pauline over his spectacles. Miss Wells, you have made a serious accusation in this court, and you are under no legal obligation to speak without counsel. Do you understand that? I do, Your Honor, she said. And are you choosing to proceed without counsel? I am, she said, because what I have to present does not require legal language. It requires plain fact. A murmur went through the gallery. The judge studied her for a long moment, and then he said something that she would remember for the rest of her life. Miss Wells, you have the floor. She drew a breath. She had rehearsed this. She had sat at her kitchen table for 3 weeks in the evenings, after the documents were organized and Owen had gone home, and she had spoken her argument aloud to the walls of the house she had built. And the walls had not answered, but the practice had made the words feel like her own in a way that arguments only feel when you have lived inside them long enough. Your Honor, she began, the document Mr. Fitch has presented as a homestead intent filing dated June 4, 1880 is not a valid record. I will show you 3 reasons why. She placed Henley's surveyor report on the judge's table. She placed her own land office receipt, dated August 26, 1880, beside it. and she placed a carefully copied excerpt from the county plat book with the undated annotation marked clearly. "First," she said, "Mr. Art Henley, a licensed surveyor out of Wichita, has confirmed that the original survey of the northwest quadrant above Crooked Creek was accurate and properly registered in 1879. The suggestion of a survey error on which Mr. Drennan's objection rests is therefore without basis." She heard a sound from Fitch's table. She did not look at him. "Second, the plat book notation that has been used to support the claim of pre-existing range leasing priority was written in the hand of Gerald Prout, the county land officer, and bears no date, no countersignature, and no corresponding record in the standard registration log. Mr. Henley's report includes a handwriting comparison that demonstrates this annotation was added by Mr. Prout after the original plat was recorded. It was not a contemporaneous entry. It was an addition made in service of a later claim." The room was not quite silent yet, but it was getting there. She could feel it compressing around her words. "Third," she said, and her voice was steady, 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 because she had built it that way. "The document Mr. Fitch has presented as a homestead intent filing dated June 4th does not appear in the standard homestead registration log at the county land office. I have a certified copy of that log, provided to me by the territorial registrar in Topeka, who I wrote to in December." She placed the copy on the judge's table. "No filing by Silas Drennan for the Northwest Crooked Creek section appears in that log at any date. Not in June of 1880, not at any time before my own filing in August of 1880. She stopped. The room was silent, not the silence of disinterest. The silence of a room full of people who had been following a story and had just reached the place where the story turned, and were holding their breath to see what came next. Judge Beecroft looked at the documents on his table. He looked at them for a long time. He picked up the certified log copy and read it. He looked at Fitch. "Mr. Fitch," he said. Fitch stood up. His face had rearranged itself into the expression of a man who has seen several doors close at once and is trying to determine which remaining window is large enough to climb through. "Your Honor, the filing in question is not recorded in the territorial log," the judge said, "which takes precedence over the county records. That is the law, Mr. Fitch, and I believe you know it. Your Honor, there may be an administrative error, 3 administrative errors," the judge said, with a dryness that silenced the lawyer completely. "Coincidentally all benefiting the same party. I don't believe in that kind of coincidence, Mr. Fitch." He set down his spectacles. He looked at Silas Drennan, who had gone the color of bleached cotton, and at Gerald Prout in the gallery, who looked as though he wanted to dissolve through the floor. "The objection filed by Mr. Drennan against the homestead claim of Miss Pauline Wells on the northwest quadrant above Crooked Creek is dismissed," the judge said. "The original claim stands as filed and recorded. Furthermore, I am directing the territorial attorney's office to examine the circumstances surrounding the undated plat annotation and the unregistered document presented in this proceeding." He paused. "Court is adjourned." The gavel came down. For one moment there was absolute silence. Then the room broke open into noise, the eruption of 30 people all deciding simultaneously that they had something to say. And through all of it, Pauline stood at her table with her hands flat on the wood and breathed. Owen was there before the noise finished resolving. He moved through the crowd with a focused efficiency that cleared a path without requiring anyone to be pushed. And he stopped at the edge of her table, and she turned and looked at him. And whatever was on his face, she was going to carry with her for the rest of her life. "Pauline," he said. She stepped forward and he caught her, one hand at her elbow and one at her back. Not an embrace exactly, but something close enough that everyone in the room who was still paying attention could see what it meant. "You wrote to the territorial registrar," he said. "In December," she said. "While you were helping me organize the documents. I sent the letter the same day I sent the payment to Henley." He looked at her with something close to wonder. "You did all of that without telling me. "You told me to get something documented and specific and hard to look away from," she said. "I did," he laughed. It was a short, low sound, genuinely surprised, and it was the best sound she had heard in months. Silas Drennan left the courthouse with his lawyer and said nothing to anyone, but the color had not returned to his face, and the small, quiet, satisfied smile was gone permanently. Gerald Prout was escorted from the gallery by a deputy before he could reach the street, which was Owen's doing. He had spoken to the territorial attorney in Topeka by telegraph in January, after seeing Henley's report, and arrangements had been made. The territorial investigation that followed took 4 months, and at the end of it, Gerald Prout was convicted of fraudulent alteration of public records and lost his position. Aldous Fitch resigned from the County Bar Association before proceedings against him could be completed and left the territory. Silas Drennan was never criminally charged because the link between him and the forgery was circumstantial, but the civil finding against his objection was a matter of record, and the county bank called in 2 notes he had been carrying on the strength of the Crooked Creek Range expansion, and within a year he had sold 2,000 acres and shrunk considerably. None of that mattered to Pauline on the January afternoon after the hearing, when she drove back north to her homestead in the cold, bright sun with Owen riding beside her on his horse. He was not on duty. He had asked the sheriff for the afternoon, and the sheriff, aware that his own position was now under scrutiny from the territorial attorney, had not argued. They drove through the late afternoon light, and the grassland was gold and cold, and the creek was still frozen at its edges but moving at the center. And when she pulled the wagon to a stop in front of her house, she sat for a moment and looked at all of it. "It's mine," she said, simply, as a fact. "It's yours," he said. She climbed down from the wagon, and he came down from his horse, and he stood in front of her in the winter light and said, with the same directness she had come to love in everything about him, "I want to ask you something." "Ask it," she said. "I want to court you," he said, "formally and properly, with your full knowledge and consent, and without anything complicated between us." She looked at him for a moment. "You've been courting me since September," she said. "I've been circling around it," he said. "I want to stop circling." She reached up and straightened the badge on his coat, which was crooked as always. She kept her hand on his lapel and felt the warmth of him through the wool. "Yes," she said. "Court me formally and properly, Owen Calloway." He put his hand over hers on his lapel and held it there, and he kissed her in the winter light outside the house she had built, and it was warm and certain and full of the particular tenderness of 2 people who have seen each other clearly and chosen each other deliberately. Spring came to the Kansas plain in the slow, stubborn way it always did, pushing through the cold inch by inch until one morning you walked out and realized that the world had quietly turned green while you were managing other things. Pauline's kitchen garden came up clean and full, the fence held, and the creek ran high with snowmelt and made a sound at the north edge of the property that she had come to think of as the sound of everything being right. Owen came out every Sunday afternoon. This was the formal arrangement, though he was also present in the less formal ways that had become habitual, checking her fences on his rounds, stopping in when he was passing north, repairing the things that needed repairing with the quiet competence she had stopped pretending not to find deeply attractive. But Sunday afternoons were the intentional time, the time set aside, and they were the best part of her week. They talked. She had forgotten, living alone through the winter, what it was like to have someone to talk to who was genuinely interested in being talked to. Owen was a listener of a particular quality, not passive, not merely polite, but actively engaged, asking the follow-up questions that told her he had been paying attention to the previous thing she said, tracking the longer threads of what she was thinking about. They talked about the land and about the law and about the territorial politics that shaped both. They talked about their histories, the parts they had been carrying separately and were learning to share. He told her about his years on the range, the specific kind of loneliness of that life, the way the sky and the work could fill you up and still leave a room empty somewhere. She told him about Richard, honestly and without apology, about who he had been and what she had loved about him and what she had learned from losing him. Owen listened to all of it. He did not try to compare or compete or reassure her in the ways that people reassure you when they are actually trying to move past something. He simply held it alongside the other things he knew about her, and it became part of the whole picture. In April, she told him she loved him. Not because it was the right moment or because something had prompted it, but because it was true, and she did not see the point of not saying true things. He was sitting on her step in the Sunday afternoon sun, drinking coffee, looking out at the kitchen garden that was just beginning to show green above the turned earth. He had brought her seeds from the mercantile, a variety of pole beans she had mentioned wanting to try. He did that, remembered the small things she said, and then brought them back to her in physical form, quietly and without ceremony. "I love you," she said. He turned to look at her. The afternoon light was on his face and his eyes were that careful green she had been reading for months. "I love you, Pauline," he said. "I have been meaning to tell you that." "You've been telling me in other ways," she said, "for months." "I wanted to say it in the actual words," he said, "because I think you deserve the actual words." She sat down beside him on the step, close enough that their arms were touching, and they sat like that for a long time in the spring sun, not talking, listening to the creek at the north edge of the property making its steady sound. May came in green and generous, and Owen proposed to her on a Saturday afternoon by the creek, standing in the grass with the water running cold and clear over the stones. He had a ring that had been his mother's, a simple gold band, and he said that if she wanted something more elaborate he would get it, but that he had wanted her to have this one if she would take it. She put it on her hand and said yes without any of the deliberation people might have expected, because she had already done all the deliberating, which was the work of the previous several months, and she was certain. She was more certain of this than she had been of most things, and she was a woman who was careful about certainty. He kissed her by the creek, and she held onto the lapels of his coat the way she had been wanting to hold on to something solid since the day she arrived in Kansas, and the creek made its steady sound, and the prairie stretched out in every direction, enormous and green and absolutely, completely hers. They were married in June 1881 at the First Methodist Church in Dodge City, which was a small white building that was cold in winter and hot in summer, and exactly the right size for the people Pauline had collected in her months in the territory. Clarence Muir stood up for her. 3 women from the town who had become friends over the months of the land dispute, women who had watched her stand up in that courtroom and speak, sat in the front pew, and wept the cheerful tears of people who have been following a story and are satisfied with how it ended. Owen stood at the front of the church in a dark coat that fit him better than anything she had seen him wear before, which meant he had bought it specifically for this, which meant he had gone to the tailor and let himself be measured and stood still for it, all of which she found so specifically, privately endearing that she had to look at her bouquet for a moment to compose herself. The minister read the words and they said the words back, looking at each other steadily as people who mean the words look at each other, and she felt Richard Wells somewhere at the back of the space, not as a presence that competed with this one, but as a person who had been part of what made her into someone capable of standing here, and she held that gently and let it be what it was. Owen slid the ring onto her finger, the simple gold band that had been his mother's. She had kept it on her hand since May, and it had already become something she could not imagine her hand without. The summer of 1881 was the best summer of Pauline Calloway's life, which is the name she was now going by, though she kept Wells as her middle name and always would, because that was the name on the deed and the name that had stood up in court and the name that had been tested and had held. Owen moved his things to the homestead, which was large enough and more than large enough for 2 people, and he resigned from the deputy position in July without regret. He had been thinking about it for months. He told her the work had served its purpose, which was to be useful in a place where useful things were needed, But the sheriff's compromised position had been making the work feel less honest than he required, and there was 320 acres of Kansas grassland that needed someone who was willing to build something on it. He was willing, more than willing. She watched him take hold of the homestead with the same focused energy she had brought to it, and she watched the place expand and improve under the combination of both their attentions. And she thought that this was the answer to the thing she had been trying to work out since leaving St. Louis. That independence did not mean solitude, and that building something with someone who was genuinely your equal did not diminish the thing you had built but made it larger. They planted winter wheat that fall on 40 acres of the section's eastern half, breaking the ground with a plow Owen had bought second-hand from a neighbor to the south, who was leaving the territory. She drove the horse and he guided the plow, and they traded positions every hour so neither of them wore out before the end of the day, and in the evening they were too tired to talk much and sat by the fire, and that was its own kind of closeness. In November, Pauline discovered she was expecting a child. She told Owen on a Sunday evening by the fire, quietly, watching his face. He went very still for a moment, and then something happened to his expression that she did not have a word for and might not have needed one for, because it was complete on its own. "Pauline," he said. "Sometime in late spring, I think," she said. He crossed the room to where she was sitting and knelt beside her chair and took both her hands and held them the way he had held them on that first January night, carefully and with full intention, and he said, "Are you all right? How do you feel?" "I feel fine," she said honestly. "I feel better than fine. I feel like everything is going according to a plan I didn't know I had." He put his forehead against their joined hands and she felt him breathe. "A child," he said very quietly, like he was testing the word in the air. "Yes," she said. He looked up at her with the green eyes that she now knew as well as her own reflection, better in some ways, and he said, "I'm so glad you came to Kansas, Pauline." "I came for the land," she said. "I know," he said. "So did I," she laughed, and he laughed, and in the warm room with the fire burning and the prairie dark and still outside and the winter wheat in the ground waiting for spring, they held on to each other and let the fullness of it settle. The winter was long but not cruel that year, and Pauline spent it in good health and better spirits, managing the homestead through the cold months with the efficiency she brought to everything, with Owen alongside her at every step. He was an attentive man in the most practical possible sense, anticipating what was needed before it was asked for, adjusting the work to what she could comfortably manage as the months progressed, doing the heaviest lifting without comment or ceremony. Clarence Muir came over for Sunday dinners and brought vegetables from his root cellar, and told stories about the territory's early years that Pauline collected carefully, aware that she was listening to the living history of a place she had decided to belong to. She wrote things down in the evenings, a habit she had developed during the land dispute, and never given up observations, accounts, the shape of things as they were. Spring came again in the slow Kansas way, green pushing through cold, and on a morning in late April 1882, Pauline's son was born. He was born at the homestead with the help of a woman named Ada Briggs, who served as the closest thing Dodge City had to a midwife, and who was calm and competent and excellent under pressure. Owen was in the house, which was not common practice, and about which Ada had opinions, but Pauline had said she wanted him there, and that was that. It was a hard morning and then a good one, and when Ada placed the baby in Pauline's arms and she looked down at his face, small and red and completely himself, she felt the specific and irreducible love that has no preparation and needs none. Owen sat beside the bed and looked at his son with an expression she had not seen on him before, which was the expression of someone encountering something that has permanently rearranged their internal geography. "What shall we name him?" she said. "I was thinking," he said carefully, "about the name Henry, my father's name." "Henry Calloway," she said, testing it. "Henry Wells Calloway." Owen looked at her. "Wells is going in somewhere," she said. "The land and the name go together." "Henry Wells Calloway," he said. "Yes." Henry Wells Calloway grew through that first year into a solid, bright-eyed, determinedly mobile small person who had his father's coloring and his mother's precision of movement, and who regarded the homestead as though it had been specifically constructed for his investigation of it. He crawled through the kitchen garden at 6 months, pulling himself along the rows with focused intensity. He took his first steps at 10 months, directly toward the fence, because he had seen his parents working on it and had decided that was where the important things happened. Owen watched him with a look of constant, low-level amazement that he had never worn in his deputy years, and that suited him better than the badge had. The homestead continued to grow. The winter wheat had done well in its first year, and they expanded the planting in the second. They added to the cattle herd and built a proper barn in the summer of 1882 with help from Clarence and 2 other homesteading families who had settled on sections nearby. A community was forming north of Crooked Creek, slowly and with the particular bonds of people who had chosen hard things and survived them, and Pauline was at the center of it in the way that people who speak clearly and act honestly tend to become the center of things. In 1883, she was asked to serve on the Territorial Homestead Advisory Committee, a body that reviewed disputed claims and recommended policy to the territorial legislature. She accepted. She brought Owen, who understood the law and the land in the specific combination that the committee most needed, and he served unofficially as her advisor in the way that he had always served unofficially as the person who understood exactly what she was doing and helped her do it better. They went to Topeka twice a year for committee meetings and stayed at a proper hotel and ate dinner at a restaurant with white tablecloths, which felt after their daily lives an extravagance so absolute it was almost comic. Owen ordered coffee every time with the specific satisfaction of a man who had spent years drinking it badly made, and she ordered whatever was most interesting on the menu, and they talked about everything: the homestead, Henry, the committee, the territory, the slow work of building something just in a place where injustice had been the habit. On a Tuesday evening in the spring of 1883, sitting across from her at the white tablecloth restaurant in Topeka with the light of the wall sconces warm on his face, Owen said, "I want to ask you something." "Ask it," she said, which is what she always said. "Are you happy?" he said. She looked at him. It was not a question she had expected, which was unusual because she had become good at expecting his questions. "Yes," she said. "Are you?" "I'm so happy it's strange to me," he said. "I'm not accustomed to it. I keep looking at it sideways to make sure it's real." She reached across the white tablecloth and put her hand over his. "It's real," she said. He turned his hand over and held hers. "Good," he said. She was expecting again by the summer of 1883. Which she told him on a Sunday evening by the creek with Henry asleep on Owen's shoulder, exhausted by a full day of investigating the property's every corner. Owen received the news with the same quality of stillness he brought to everything significant, the moment of full stop before the full opening. "Another one," he said. "Another one," she confirmed. Henry stirred slightly on his shoulder and Owen put a hand on the small back automatic, the gesture of someone who has been doing it long enough that it has become part of how his body moves through space. "Henry's going to be indignant," Owen said. "Henry is going to adapt," Pauline said. "He adapts to everything," she was right. Their daughter arrived in February of 1884, small and precise and audible, and Henry, now 22 months old and deeply invested in his own authority over the household, regarded her with the cautious territorial assessment of someone who recognizes that a significant variable has entered the equation. Within a week, he had decided she was acceptable. Within a month, he had adopted the policy of placing himself between her cradle and anything he perceived as a potential threat, which included Clarence Muir, the cat, and the large hat Owen wore in winter. They named her Clara Mee Calloway. Mee had been Pauline's mother's name. Clara was different from Henry in the way that children who come from the same parents and the same ground manage to be fundamentally different. Where Henry was steady and methodical, Clara was quick and fierce. where Henry observed before he moved, Clara moved and observed simultaneously, and where Henry expressed himself in considered sentences that arrived complete, Clara expressed herself in a running commentary on everything she encountered that paused only when she was sleeping. Owen adored them both with the contained intensity of someone who had not expected. When he rode into Dodge City 8 years before with nothing but a horse and a deputy's application, to end up here, on 320 acres of Kansas grassland, with a woman who had stood in a courthouse and spoken until the room went silent, and 2 children who were going to be remarkable people. He thought about this sometimes in the mornings, early, before anyone else was awake, standing on the step with his coffee in the first light. The prairie in early morning had a quality of absolute quiet that the day gradually dismantled, and he used those minutes to locate himself, to understand clearly where he was and how he had gotten there, and why it was exactly right. He had not planned this life. He had planned much smaller things: survival, usefulness, doing the right thing in the situations that presented themselves. He had not planned Pauline Wells coming through the door of the sheriff's office with her jaw set, and her papers in order, and her complete absence of interest in being told what she could or could not do. He had not planned falling in love with someone who made him more himself rather than less. But the best things were like that, he had learned. They did not arrive as plans. They arrived as the woman who gets off the Santa Fe Railroad with a single trunk and a legal filing and changes the geography of everything. In the spring of 1885, the Homestead produced its best wheat harvest to date, 48 bushels to the acre on the expanded eastern section. Pauline and Owen stood at the edge of the field in the warm June evening and looked at it together, the grain heavy and golden in the last light. And she thought of the October day she had driven out here for the first time in a hired wagon with her fence posts and her hammer and her absolute untested certainty that this was going to work. "Do you remember the first time I drove out here?" she said. "I was loading lumber into your wagon," he said. "You said you had it." "I did have it," she said. "I know," he said. "I just had it faster," she laughed. He put his arm around her shoulders and she leaned into him, and the wheat moved in the evening air, and the creek made its steady sound to the north, and somewhere behind them in the house, Henry was telling Clara a story about something, his voice carrying in that particular earnest way of a 4-year-old conducting important narration, and Clara's voice intersecting with questions that he was attempting to answer with increasing patience. "Silas Drennan sold his last section," Owen said. "I heard in town yesterday." "I know," Pauline said. "Gerald Prout got out of prison in March. He left the territory." "Good," she said, not with bitterness, just as a fact, clean and done. She thought about the courtroom, the gavel, the silence after she stopped speaking. She thought about how frightened she had been in the moment before she stood up, not of Drennan or Fitch or the judge, but of the specific fear that she would say the truth and it would not be enough, that the documents she had carried all the way from Topeka, and the surveyor she had written to in December, and all the work of all the months would be insufficient against the weight of a man with money and connections, and a long history of getting what he wanted. It had been enough. The truth had been enough when she laid it out clearly and completely and let it be seen. She had learned something in that room. Not that justice was guaranteed. She knew better than that and always would. But that it was possible, with enough preparation and enough clarity and enough willingness to stand up and speak even when your hands were shaking, to make the truth harder to ignore than it was to face. She carried that with her now into the committee work, into the territory's slow business of becoming something better than it had been. She presented at the territorial legislature in Topeka in the fall of 1885, arguing for expanded protections for single-holder homestead claims, particularly those held by widows and women filing as independent heads of household. The amended provisions she helped draft were adopted in 1886, and Clarence Muir told her, when she came home and told him about it, that she was the finest thing that had happened to the Northwest Crooked Creek section since the creek itself. She accepted that. Owen had taken on the management of their cattle operation with the thoroughness he brought to everything, building the herd to 60 head by 1886 and establishing a regular selling arrangement with a cattle buyer out of Wichita who came twice a year and always arrived early because he did not want to miss Owen's coffee. The homestead had moved from subsistence to something that could properly be called prosperity, not the large bovine prosperity of the Drennan model, but the solid, real, founded on actual work kind that could be passed on. They talked about passing it on in the evening sometimes, what they were building for Henry and Clara, and whoever else might come. Henry at 5 was already following his father through the fields with a small-scale intensity that suggested he had already decided the land was his to learn. Clara at 3 was following Pauline with the same intensity and asking better questions. "She's going to be you," Owen said one evening, watching Clara explain something to her ragdoll in a tone that could only be called prosecutorial. "She's going to be better than me," Pauline said. "She has the advantage of having somewhere to start from." Owen looked at her in the firelight with the expression she had learned to read as the one that meant he was thinking something he was going to say carefully. "You know what you did," he said. "Not just the land. The committee work, the legislature, the other homesteaders you've helped. You know what you started." "We started," she said. "You started," he said firmly, "in August of 1880. When you walked into a land office and put your papers on the counter and refused to be moved." She was quiet for a moment. "I was so frightened," she said. "That whole first year, I don't think I let myself know how frightened I was while it was happening." "I know," he said. "How did you know?" "I was very careful not to show it." "You drove fence stakes at 6 in the morning," he said. "You only did that when you were working something through." She stared at him. "You noticed that in October." "I noticed everything about you in October," he said. "I was badly in love with you by November and making extremely poor decisions about mentioning it." She started laughing. "You were perfectly restrained." "I was in agony," he said, and he said it so plainly and with such complete lack of self-pity that she laughed harder, and he started laughing too, and Henry appeared in the doorway of the bedroom in his nightshirt wanting to know what was funny. And Owen scooped him up and said that a very silly thing had happened years ago and would he like to hear about it, and Henry said yes. And Owen told him a version of the story that was age-appropriate and omitted the agony and featured more lumber loading than the original. And Henry listened with his head on his father's shoulder and his eyes getting heavy, and Pauline watched them both in the firelight and thought, "This is the thing I came to Kansas for. This is the specific thing, and it has no name except right." The years move through their seasons in the way that years do when you are busy enough to live in them fully and have the sense to pay attention. Clarence Muir died in the winter of 1887, peacefully, in his own house, and Pauline sat with him in his last days and read to him from the volume of natural history that had been hers since Christmas of 1880, and that she had long since memorized in the passages that mattered to her. She told him at the end that he had been one of the first things that had made the territory feel like home, and he had looked at her with his kind old eyes and said that she had made it something worth being home in, and those were the last words she heard him say. She grieved him genuinely and without apology, and planted an apple tree at the north fence in his memory, which had no practical purpose but seemed necessary. In 1888 she had a third child, another boy, whom they named James Richard Calloway. Richard for her first husband, because she had told Owen that she wanted to carry that name forward, and Owen had understood, which was one of the things she loved most about him. The quality of his understanding, the way he held the whole picture of her without requiring any part of it to be erased. James Richard was from the first day a child with strong opinions about comfort, and his opinions were extremely vocal, and he and Clara in the same household produced a level of narration and commentary that Henry, now 7, and developing a taste for quiet, regarded with the philosophical stoicism of the eldest who has accepted that the household he grew up in no longer exists. Owen, watching all three of them, had the look of a man who has received more than he bargained for and cannot identify a single thing he would return. The homestead in the late 1880s had become a proper farm: wheat, cattle, a kitchen garden that Pauline had expanded into a proper half-acre kitchen garden and orchard, a smokehouse, a root cellar, a barn that was better built than the house had originally been, and a house that had been added to twice and now had 4 bedrooms and a parlor with bookshelves. The bookshelves were full. This was partially Pauline's doing and partially Owen's, because he was a reader who had been accumulating books in corners and saddlebags and the single shelf above his old desk at the sheriff's office for years. And once there were proper shelves, he filled them with the same thoroughness he applied to everything else. Henry read everything on them as soon as he was able, and could be found on Sunday afternoons with a volume in his lap working through something 3 years above his age. Clara read the ones that interested her and declined the ones that did not with perfect equanimity, and James Richard used them primarily as a measuring system to track how tall he was getting. In 1890, Pauline was asked to attend a women's suffrage convention in Kansas City. Kansas had been advancing women's rights faster than most territories and states, giving women the right to vote in municipal elections in 1887, and the movement was pushing for full state suffrage. She went with Owen, and they left the children with a neighbor and spent 3 days in Kansas City at a convention full of remarkable women, and a surprising number of men who had also decided this was right. And she spoke on the second day about the Homestead Act and the land dispute and the courthouse and the judge who had told her she had the floor. She spoke as she had spoken then until the room was silent. Afterward, a woman from Lawrence, Kansas, a former teacher named Harriet Crane, found her in the corridor and said, "You should write this down, all of it, in full." "I've been writing it down for years," Pauline said, "in journals." "No," Harriet said, "publish it, so other women know it was possible." She went home and thought about it for 3 months, and then she wrote it down. Not the journals, which were private, but the account of the homestead, from the Santa Fe Railroad to the land office to the creek to the courthouse to the committee and everything in between. She wrote it clearly and completely and without embellishment because the plain facts were sufficient. Owen read every draft and told her where she was hedging and told her when she was at her best and helped her with the parts that required precision. The account was published in 1892 in a Kansas City journal and reprinted in 2 Chicago papers and 1 in New York. And she received letters for years after from women who had read it and used it and built their own things out of it. She kept every letter. She kept them in the leather satchel that had held her homestead papers, the one she had carried into the courtroom on January 28, 1881. It was well worn by now, the corners soft and dark with handling, and it sat on the shelf beside the books and was the first thing she would reach for if the house were on fire, after the children, after Owen. He was reading on the evening of their 12th wedding anniversary, sitting in his chair by the fire with Henry beside him, going through a catalog of agricultural equipment with the focused attention of a young man who was going to be very specific about what he wanted for the farm when it was his. Clara was at the table writing a letter to a school friend in Dodge City, and James Richard had fallen asleep on the rug in the way children fall asleep when they have finally run out of opinions for the day. Pauline stood in the doorway between the kitchen and the parlor and looked at all of them, the lamplight warm on everything, the fire steady, the wind outside moving over the plain in the way it always moved, changing its voice from season to season but never stopping. Owen looked up from his book and saw her in the doorway. "What are you thinking?" he said. "Everything I would say if I were writing it down," she said. He smiled. The smile that she had first seen in October of 1880, outside the lumber yard in the coming rain, that had changed his face into something warmer and younger and more open. It had deepened over the years into something richer, worn in by time and daily use and the specific comfort of smiling at someone who knows you, but it was the same smile, hers since before she admitted it. "Come sit with me," he said. She crossed the room and sat beside him close, the way she always sat now, and he put his arm around her without looking up from his book, automatic and complete, and she opened her own book, and the fire burned and the wind moved, and the creek ran north of the property making its steady sound, and Henry explained the difference between a single-bottom and a double-bottom plow to James Richard, who woke up just enough to agree, and Clara paused her letter writing to ask how to spell a word. And Owen told her, and the evening went on into the night in the full, warm, unextraordinary way of a life that is exactly what it was supposed to be. Outside, the prairie went on in every direction under the Kansas stars, enormous and patient, and crossed by a creek that curved like a question mark through the northwest corner of a piece of land that was owned, free and clear, by a woman named Pauline Wells Calloway, who had arrived on a train with a trunk and a legal filing and a certainty she had earned the hard way, and who had spoken in a courtroom on a January morning until the room went silent, and who had planted her flag in this particular piece of the earth and refused to move, and who had built on that foundation everything worth having. The apple tree at the north fence put out blossoms every spring. The creek ran every season. The wheat came up year after year out of the same ground, different and the same, and the children grew, and the house held, and the love that had started with a carefully driven fence stake, and a pair of hands appearing at the end of a plank of lumber held too, held through everything, held as well as anything that had been built by two people who knew what they were building and had meant every nail.